It is very, very disturbing when I hear the millionaire or billionaire word. And I told them to stop it, knock it off. Infrastructure, no bumps in the road. It needs to be simple. Keep it simple.
This is not beanbag.
I feel I have to get the gushing out first.
That'll keep the testosterone flowing.
You see people's feedback loops interrupted.
%52 of American millennials would like to live in a socialist or communist America. Socialism here in America. Yes, indeed, boo. Yes, indeed, hiss.
MFer, I want more iced tea.
And maybe we need a solution to it that risks the imagination of a new kind of possibility.
Hashtag me too.
I knew this day would come, but I didn't expect it so soon.
Eu acho que eu e muita gente no Brasil passou fome, ou seja, não foram poucas as vezes em que você levantava de manhã e você não tinha o pão para tomar o café, você não tinha o que comer no almoço. E eu acho que isso na minha vida foi importante porque isso me deu, eu diria, mais força para sobreviver, me deu mais vontade de lutar e é por isso que eu tenho uma obsessão para que a gente possa acabar com a fome no mundo. Ou seja, não é possível que uma criança não tenha um copo de leite para tomar todo dia, não é possível que a criança não possa ter 3 refeições por dia. Isso deveria ser um direito sagrado, sabe, que todos nós deveríamos colocar em prática. A gente vê tanta comida jogada fora, tanto restaurante joga coisa fora, na casa das pessoas sobra comida para jogar fora e a gente sabe que próximo da gente tem gente que está sem comer. Eu, na verdade, gosto de tudo. Ou seja, de uma boa rabada, uma boa feijoada, uma belíssima buchada, uma grande macarronada, mas o que é bom mesmo, que não enjoa nunca, que você pode comer do dia que nasce ao dia que morre, é um pratinho de feijão arroz, um bife acebolado e um ovo frito.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. It is episode 100. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate every single person that has made this possible, including, of course, the whole team. Matt, David, Forrest, Vic, Artesia, Mark, Ben, Rich. Ton of people help make this happen and make it happen every week. And of course, each and every one of you watching, most importantly, our patrons, but everybody who interacts and shares, we appreciate it. We're going very strong and only going to continue to do so. Catch him promoting Bernie Sanders. On this week's program, the great Brooke Thomas. She's making her debut on TMBS. She's a TV journalist, anchor. She's a co-host on The Young Turks. We're talking about the bizarre assassination of a Gambino family crime boss and how it relates to the QAnon conspiracy culture. Then we're also talking about the Central Park Five and why they tell you absolutely everything you need to know about this grotesque thing, Donald Trump, that's in the White House. Then, very excited about this, Celso Amorim. He's the former foreign minister of Brazil. He served as foreign minister under political prisoner Lula da Silva. He served as defense minister under Dilma Rousseff. We did a 40-minute conversation on the rise of the global far right, the failure of globalization, democracy, Lula, and what a non-aligned foreign policy looks like. I recorded this just a couple of days with him. We're playing it tonight. Then we have a gem with David Griscom. What do we have on the Griscom? Oh, by the way, we need to fix that graphic. We can't use that graphic.
No, it's getting fixed right now, actually.
The Ikanananek. What do we have, David?
We're going to be talking about why we need to take control of our power plants across the United States to have a Green New Deal.
Very nice. Socialism here. And of course, we have a shout out in the post game, dissecting Kamala Harris's healthcare moves, Boris Johnson's first couple of days in office, a strategic plan against the Lib Dems, and a visit touching on what's happening in Yemen, and a whole lot more on the Michael Brooks Show, special Monday show tonight, of course. Next Tuesday, we're back to regular schedule, August 6th. Professor Richard Wolff returns to discuss China. But first, something really exciting happened a couple of days ago. Cornel West, the most important public intellectual in America, went and visited Joe Rogan. And Joe and I follow each other on Twitter, and I believe in positive reinforcement, so I gave him a huge amount of props for this exchange of actual ideas, history, and human spirit. Cornel West has so much to teach every single part of the left, and really every single person who strives to do politics, culture, humanity better. But let's start with the notion of how he relates to the left and how he goes on a platform like Rogan's. He doesn't, at any point, sacrifice his core commitments. He spoke regularly on the real history of this country, the genocide of Native Americans, the ongoing legacies of slavery, white supremacy. He spoke strongly on the rights and humanity of transgender people. But he did it in a way that was broad, inclusive, and ultimately profoundly appealing to all people, because it was not rooted in hectoring moralism, a seek to purify, a seek to cancel, or a subculture, but in fact in an enlarging argument of how dismantling these systems and understanding how history actually works will make all of our lives better. This is the radical, uncompromising, yet profoundly inviting and visionary message that we need to embody as the left, and no one does better than Cornel West. Check him out with Joe Rogan here, Reframing Socialism.
That is this narrative, and how does that narrative get reshaped? Because that narrative of that the only reason why people want socialism is because they want a free ride.
Right. Oh, that's a wonderful question, brother. One is that we had to listen very closely to our right-wing brothers and sisters. and conservatives and middlers, because oftentimes, I mean, they're human beings like anybody else, and they've had their own arguments. I don't think they have strong ones, but they have their own arguments. So the first thing you'd say about that is, what makes you think that the well-to-do don't have free rides? What is inheriting wealth all about?
Well, inheriting wealth is free ride.
Absolutely.
That's all it is.
What is the connections of getting into the prep schools and the Ivy League schools and so forth? Even though they work, it's still a kind of free ride.
Yes.
So if they're preoccupied with this issue of being free ride, we tell them, let's make sure that people do work hard.
Yes.
And sacrifice, and therefore in some way deserve what they have. Now, if just based on that principle, the upper echelons of American society would be indicted.
Yes.
Deeply indicted. Deeply, profoundly indicted. He invited, he brought in the frame, and then actually won the larger actual argument here about what privilege, what access, what supposedly not doing the work is. He also wasn't afraid of celebrating greatness. There's no contradiction between a radically egalitarian democratic politics that materially assures everybody that still is going to want to pursue human distinction and greatness and artistic, athletic, and all other endeavors. He celebrates that. He talks about a rich and dynamic culture along with understanding profoundly our interdependence, both to each other and in our broader ecology. His ability to recognize people as complex individuals beyond how capitalist realism and projects that flow out of capitalist realism see them, only as competitive subjects in a market, or the essentialist left, simply as amalgamations of identities with ascriptive identities and behaviors that are acceptable or unacceptable. He sees people as broad living organisms. And that's why when he even calls Donald Trump a gangster, even someone as Donald Trump, which is, you could not find an easier person to simply write off for being a thoroughly grotesque, evil person than Donald Trump. He's up there in the top tier. Cornel West is still turning back on himself in terms of, I have my own gangster traits. The irony of this ability to self-access and not exclude anybody in a fundamentalist, fanatical way actually incentivizes the types of self-inquiry and capacity to actually truly transform institutions, individuals, economics, and behaviors and culture. When Gramsci talked about hegemony, he was talking about a bold strategy to win over people to Marxism from across cultural and regional groups, not to force a specific culture on society. We need to be winning over football fans, hype beasts, and everyone else. That doesn't mean you for a second compromise on your values. I've never seen somebody more committed, frankly, to a broader set of values. Marxist, Christian, humanist, civic, and revolutionary than Cornel West. That synthesis, that broadness, that's why I admire the man so much. There's too much focus on making socialism a social distinction. It's not. It's a movement for liberation that means including many different people. And of course, that brings us back to Mark Fisher's genius 2014 essay that we haven't fully absorbed yet, The Vampire Castle. A socialism that's exclusive cannot win, and is exactly the kind of toxic strategy that we need to avoid on all costs and only plays into the hands of capital. As Mark Fisher argued, why would capital be concerned about a left that replaces class politics with moralizing individualism that's far from building solidarity and spreads fear and insecurity? This is also why, though, that when we talk about things like love and vision and empathy, it includes all of that, includes the changes, and includes the transformations in a broad, inviting, and strategic way. Gramsci said, the popular element feels but does not always know or understand. The intellectual element knows but does not always understand, and in particular does not always feel. We need to free ourselves from the habit. This is also Gramsci from the selected writing. We need to free ourselves from the habit of seeing culture as an encyclopedia of knowledge and men as mere receptacles to be stuffed of empirical data and a mass of unconnected raw facts which have to be filled in the brain as columns of a dictionary, enabling their owner to respond to the various stimuli of the outside world. And finally, the challenge of modernity is to live without illusions, without becoming disillusioned. I'm a pessimism because of intelligence, but an optimist because of the will. As Cornel West shows, the left can talk about ourselves as individuals, even as we speak about our broader spiritual, revolutionary, and social desires. We don't have to choose between achieving personal greatness at the expense of our neighbor or comrades. And we don't have to choose to shrink back from challenging and transforming ourselves from new systems of isolation, control, and hectoring. We can win with a politics of love, community, inclusivity. We just need to build it. That's why West did so well on Rogan. And I really mean it. Look, I don't think nobody is perfect. And another part of evolving a healthy culture is not putting anybody up on a pedestal. But that being said, there is no one else with this sort of age and stature right now holding all of this besides Cornel West. I mean, I cannot emphasize, he is absolutely the most important public intellectual we have, and we have an abundance. I mean, we have many amazing contributors. Angela Davis is still with us. We get to hang out with Richard Wolff. Obviously, Chomsky, of course, and people across the globe. It's actually great sadness to me that Asma Jahangir passed. Incredible Pakistani rights activist. But Cornel West holds these different threads in a way that's absolutely unique, and we need to model and learn from. Do you guys have anything you want to add to this?
No, I genuinely agree. I think the way Cornel buttered Rogan up talking about Richard Pryor for the first 20 minutes was fairly masterful. And I also think, it does I do think it was evident a little bit after this clip where we're talking about inheritance. Rogan shifts it, I think, I don't know if it's consciously or not, but shifts it on a more comfortable ground, like military wasteful spending, right? And that's something that is easier to swallow for the more libertarian elements of his listenership. But at the same time, when he was talking about this inheritance stuff, I mean, there's a big smile on my face because there's a whole bunch of people in that crowd that have heard the exact opposite numerous times on that platform.
Absolutely, they've been getting fairy tales and bedtime stories, naturalizing that stuff. Yeah.
And, on top of it, I think that Cornel West, the model that he was presenting of socialism as a movement, I thought it was really interesting, actually, that they talked about music and art so much in that conversation. And I don't think that was an accident or distraction. In fact, what Cornel West was doing was talking about historical movements of human greatness in art, and actually including the movement for democracy and for socialism as a part of those human expressions. Right. And I think a lot of people who are really into Joe Rogan and even some of these other more right-wing figures, they are sort of looking for models or ideas of greatness. And the fact is, as West shows, we have incredible folks to look at. And thinking about ourselves in that kind of tradition, I think is actually really lovely. And you're going to be able to win a lot of people over with that.
And it was also beautiful the way he handled the cultural appropriation thing. Once again, in a way that just transcends the dichotomies of the ahistorical racism and elimination of distinction and total lack of understanding of just material and intellectual theft that you get from the right, and then this extreme counter proposal, which literally means actually acts as if culture is in isolated boxes.
It's cultural apartheid.
And absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's literally not how it works. I mean, one of the great advantages we have against totalizing right-wing narratives against things like quote-unquote Western civilization is that isn't how culture works. That isn't how history moves. So why would we buy into that presupposition? And actually, that's where you get a really disturbing dynamic where some of the really extremes of that type of approach starts to echo the new resurgent far-right interest in the nation state, which is the emphasis, one justified, one unjustified, but at the same time, the pure emphasis of the particular over the universal. And if we don't have a universal, we're simply not going to win. And we're also not going to be involved in a broader liberatory project. Nobody again, does that better than Cornel West.
And just like to echo his words, I mean, what he said about that question was there are roots and there are routes. And he was able to find that line where he was saying, it's like, look, yeah, these are movements that come from black, the black tradition, the black culture, and the black history. And he says, and their routes are global. And like, that's like the libertarian potential of it. And that's what
right.
makes it such a, beautiful thing. And I found that was really smart rather than sort of falling into a trap that somebody on the right might love. Oh my God, he's saying there's no such thing as cultural appropriation. He didn't say that at all.
No, he didn't.
He like quite literally
Not at
just
all.
said, it's like, but there's, there's a distinction that we will have to make. And there's a fake version of this that the right wing likes to push up. And then some people, on the left accidentally push up as well. And he tore that down and made it very clear what that distinction was.
Absolutely. All right. Let's get to the shout out, gentlemen. Although, of course, anytime you talk about Cornel West, it's basically a shout out.
I'm looking for a remix. And now the shout out.
Shout out. Shout out.
Shout out. Shout out.
Shout out. The pile of ideas was turned to low. It's quickly moving into the hot position.
And now the shout out.
Shout out. Pause the video.
Shout out. Shout out.
Recovery mode.
Shout out.
My brain is
shout out. Shout out.
Geopolitical politics.
Shout out.
Competition would start kicking in.
Shout out.
I'm not funded by the Koch brothers.
Shout out.
Do some research for yourself.
Shout out. Shout out. Shout out. Shout out.
Shout out. Shout out. That's amazing. The shout out, and maybe we should just do an every week a shout out until the end of this campaign.
This is now a Bernie segment.
This is now the shout out is now the Bernie segment. Shout out to Bernie Sanders, the candidate to vote for if you really want to take on some things.
If you're not wasting your time right now.
If you're not wasting your time, Bernie Sanders. Foreign policy is not only inseparable from domestic policy. It's also, as Daniel Bessner always emphasizes, and for some very bad reasons, by the way, is the area that a president has the most immediate power over. The fact that every single other Democratic candidate in the lead is, at the end of the day, recapitulating and restating some form of warmed-over Obamaism and Clintonism. Sure, it will be a significant improvement over Trump, but that bar is low as hell. And we need a foreign policy that has some understanding of solidarity, some understanding that we need to stop constant war, significantly cut the military-industrial complex, and have an honest approach, even if it is not as radical as people with broader critiques. And I'm sure my position on Israel-Palestine is to the left of Sanders. That being said, even just a moderate and clear recognition of Palestinian humanity, you're not hearing in any substantive and consistent way from any other candidate. Although some, like Beto O'Rourke, will be willing to state the obvious that Benjamin Netanyahu is, of course, a racist. But consistently, and Peter Beinart himself noted this on Mehdi Hassan's show recently, Bernie is the one who is willing to go to organizations and question the broader policy. Elizabeth Warren's never been willing to do that. Kamala Harris and Cory Booker are to the far extreme right on this position, as is, of course, the ever-odious Joe Biden.
And just a note on Beto's, because Beto has said some good things about Netanyahu being, a racist or whatever he said, right? But the thing is how tepid that is I remember before I even worked at Majority Report when Netanyahu came and spoke in front of the GOP House, and even the House Democrats at that point were able to get their shit together.
Except for Tulsi Gabbard.
Oh, yeah.
Tulsi Gabbard went. And that was when the Republicans brought Netanyahu there to actively undermine Obama's Iran deal. And Democrats, including people like Tim Kaine, didn't go. Tulsi went. So again, I would note that.
Speaking of wasting your time.
Word. And we'll also talk about that anti-free speech, anti-democracy BDS vote in the postgame. This is Bernie Sanders on Crooked Media stating the absolute bare minimum obvious, but one that is incredibly politically courageous, and you will not hear from any other candidate.
You've been very critical of Bibi Netanyahu and the Israeli government. We spend a few $1 billion on aid to Israel. Would you ever consider using that aid as leverage to get the Israeli government to act differently?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we are giving large sums of money. Look, let me back it up before the tweets start flowing in. I lived in Israel.
Yeah.
Actually, I worked in a kibbutz for a number.
I was just gonna say, it's interesting how nervous Favreau is. Like that laughter he gave there, you can tell. Like even this question is a bit much for him to ask.
Incredible. The utter neurosis about just having an honest conversation about this, including with somebody who, I mean, another thing, just really briefly, Beinart and Hassan noted, is that you will see, because of this moderate, humane position, some right-wing Jewish groups will try to defeat the first possible Jewish president of the United States because he recognizes Palestinians are human beings. That's how utterly distorted this conversation is. But go ahead.
Flowing in. I lived in Israel. Yeah. Actually, I worked in a kibbutz for a number of months. I have family in Israel. I am Jewish. I am not anti-Israel. Okay, I believe that the people of Israel have absolutely the right to live in peace, independence, and security. End of discussion. That is what I fervently believe. But I think what has happened is, in recent years under Netanyahu, you have an extreme right-wing government with many racist tendencies. The role of the United States, and this is not easy, I believe me, Clinton tried it, Obama tried it, Jimmy Carter tried it. This is not easy stuff, is to try to finally bring peace to the Middle East and to treat the Palestinian people with the kind of respect and dignity they deserve. Our policy cannot just be pro-Israel, pro-Israel, pro-Israel. It has got to be pro-region, working with all of the people, all of the countries in that area.
That basic step, again, from a left perspective that recognizes that, of course, Israel's an apartheid state. And, of course, the policies in Gaza and the West Bank are monstrous. And, of course, they've cost many Palestinian lives. And, of course, they're analogous to Jim Crow and everything else. But the reality of our politics, and also in the vein of Cornel West, I would suggest and I would argue that the first starting point of an assertion that we are going to have a human conversation that recognizes Israeli and Palestinian humanity is a radical shift that you will not see from any other candidate. So shout out to Bernie Sanders. He is the choice. We have an absolutely unique opportunity here. It's not just that he's the leftist, most left on foreign policy, on domestic policy. He's reset the entire terrain on domestic policy. And now he's leading point on foreign policy.
Yeah, when it comes to Tulsi Gabbard or Elizabeth Warren, here's what you need to do.
It needs to be simple. Keep it simple.
Thank you.
Shut up with that stuff, guys.
Exactly. And certainly with us, because we don't have any time for any nonsense. All right. Let me just say, because we have to get to the great Brooke Thomas, let me just say, obviously, we passed a near-term goal. Thanks to all of you. We passed 2,500. The next goal is obviously 3,000. We want to get to that in the fall. And it helps us do all the content we do. In fact, it's the way we do all the content we do. And it's a huge amount of content.
Majority Report is going to be stealing our thumbnail style that we've been pioneering lately.
The pioneering on the YouTube?
Yeah, on the YouTube.
I bet they are. That's, of course, shouts to Vic Viana and Forrest for that. For their editing and strategy. Everybody who's made this show possible, I just have to thank all of you. Join us now. For 21 and above patrons, in the month of August, we're doing a 3-part series, Joshua Kahn and I. The conference calls will be movement training calls, building off of the content with Joshua. Patreon.com/TMBS. Get your tickets to Chicago, August 24th. They're flying. And we want to see you there with Chuck Mertz from This Is Hell Radio and Gene Bajlan. Left is Best Midwest Fest. We're going to take a brief break. We'll be right back with Brooke Thomas.
all of a sudden we can't talk.
Hello.
Good morning, Patriots. Good morning, Rebels.
I think this is an intellectual curiosity expedition.
The rats, the hyenas, start to eat each other.
They can't argue your points. They go ad hominem.
Seems that there's a much more negative view of fascism than communism.
And they had the worst cover-up ever.
Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show, episode 100. Thanks, everybody. Joining us now, making her debut on this auspicious show, is Brooke Thomas. She's a TV journalist and co-host at the Young Turks. Brooke, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be doing this for the first time.
It's awesome to have you. We are going to talk about, we're going to have a very New York-centric show. And we have at least segment. And let's start. We're gonna do the bizarre, messed up one second, and do this really disgusting but really important one first. And we're gonna play this clip of Donald Trump talking about the Central Park Five. And to me, there's a lot of conversation about the Central Park Five, and I feel like there's a new show on Netflix. It's back in the public conversation. And to me, obviously there's thousands of different examples of Donald Trump. He's sort of like a synthesis of all of the worst things about this country. But I think you could look at the Central Park Five as the perfect window into understanding everything about this man and his presidency. So I'm going to throw to you in a second, but first I just want to play 15 seconds of a PBS documentary of Donald Trump talking about the Central Park Five.
You better believe that I hate the people that took this girl and raped her brutally. You better believe it. And it's more than anger, it's hatred. And I want society to hate him.
Brooke, first of all, could you talk a little bit about, and I believe you call them the exonerated five, and Donald Trump's relationship to them?
Yeah, well, it's bizarre because as a private citizen, we know he's had issues with race, period, just with how he handled his own buildings, his own companies. We know that from the beginning. But as a private citizen, he took it upon himself to take out this full-page ad, essentially asking for the death penalty for, at that point, was a group of 5 children who hadn't been convicted of anything yet. It was just, this is the story going around the city. This is who did it. There were these kids in the park. They were doing all kinds of crazy things. And this is what happened to a woman who doesn't remember what happened to her. And they need to die. And, I was talking about something the other day. I think that the Central Park Five case in general, it exposes so many problems with our criminal justice system. One, how easily and I hate kind of using the phrase mob mentality, but it really does happen. It's more than when we're talking about, canceling an actress who said the N-word. We're talking about people's lives and children's lives, and none of really the details were out at all. No real proof or real DNA or identifiable evidence or eyewitnesses. And everyone decided that these 5 boys did it because they were little black kids who weren't from great neighborhoods. And the man who was to become the president of the United States, he jumped on that and was a leader in that. He spent thousands of dollars to call for their death. Not only that, but we do have the big issues with the criminal justice system and how children are treated and the problems that can occur when you send a kid to Rikers and then to men's penitentiaries. You know, there's so many issues, and my biggest issue with this now is that the president of the United States is still not willing to apologize after they've been wholly exonerated. And not only that, but
talk about that more.
You know?
Yeah.
So they have been exonerated. The man who actually did this confessed. Not only did he confess, but the DNA put him at the scene of the crime. Just him. Only him. He confessed completely. He knew details that were never released. And not only that, but he was a serial rapist and a murderer. And not only were these 5 boys, their lives were ruined. And I'm glad that they're still alive and they're able to change their lives now. But there were things that happened to these boys at the time that they can never go back and they can never just wipe away and erase. You put somebody in prison as a child, and one of the boys was sent to a men's prison, a state prison. When you put them in jail and prison as children for years, you can't just wipe that clean and the trauma that comes from that once they are set free. So yeah, their lives have changed forever, but not only did the person who did this ruin, a big part at least of their lives, but there were women who wouldn't have been raped, a woman who wouldn't have been murdered. Her children would still have their mother had the police been focused on catching the person whose DNA was at the scene of the crime.
Yeah, and I just want to read out. It's Corey Wise, Raymond Santana, Kevin Richardson, Antron McCrae, and Yusuf Salim. And they were all charged between the ages of 14 and 16 years old. They were dragged into a police station. They were not given proper representation. And they were basically bullied into confessing to something they didn't do. And at the time, there was this whole idea, I think it was, I'm so bad right now because I'm forgetting it. I think it was called wilding. But there was this,
that's what they called it.
Yeah, that's like tabloid. Can you talk about that? And I guess too, like with Trump, and I just want to quote really briefly too. He wrote, this is all, in block letters. And I just want to say, I'm not even trying to make a cheap joke here, but it's like, this is something that Donald Trump actually paid for, right? Like we know that Donald Trump has like a history of not paying people after they do work for him or anything. He immediately actually wrote a check to get an ad in a New York newspaper saying, bring back the death penalty, bring back our police, all in bold letters. So there's like a through line of, as you said, the criminal justice system. Then there's this tabloid culture that makes up this, this notion of like wilding versus like, I don't know, kids of all backgrounds, teenage boys, get up to shit. And then there's Donald Trump. Once again, because I can't separate this from the way he talks about MS-13 or terrorism or Elijah Cummings, right? Like this is the methodology of his politics.
Yeah. The words, and that's why when people say, and I don't want to get off topic too much, but when people say, should we be focusing so much on the racism, on the words? Yes, because as people will tell you over and over and over again, these words are dangerous. They lead to violence. And these words match how he's treating brown people at the border. So yes, we should be focused on what comes out of his mouth. We should be focused on who he was willing to rent an apartment to. Yes, we should be focused on him spending tens of thousands of dollars to ask for just forget the Sixth Amendment when it's black kids, huh? We should be focused on the fact that he was willing to spend thousands of dollars to ask for a bunch of kids to die. Yeah.
Right. And he said recently in front of the White House, there are people on both sides of that. They admitted their guilt. If you look at Linda Fairstein, if you look at some of the prosecutors, they think that the city should have never settled that case. So I'll leave it at that.
Which is so upsetting. Because if the city shouldn't have settled that case, they wouldn't have given out $41 million. They just wouldn't have. Why? But, they wouldn't have. And they did. They settled that case without admitting wrongdoing, but they settled that case. And of course, the woman who built her career on the backs of these boys, of course, she doesn't believe the city should have settled this case. That doesn't prove anything.
Right.
That's
Her
just
whole
common
career's
sense.
at stake.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Do you feel like there is some way of understanding, like there's the racism, there's the fear, the crime and race panics, but like something about like understanding like tabloid culture? Like a lot of people talk about the reality TV, but there's something very specific, I think, about like tabloid culture and Donald Trump too.
What do you mean?
I mean, like the way that if you listen to how he talked about like putting this ad in a New York tabloid in the 80s, the way like all of the Howard Stern interviews, some of which like I'm not going to lie, I think are pretty funny, but it's like, and then going on Fox News, like at each step of his career, he's like going to these very like tabloid places and then like almost like refining how he's going to like sell things to people, whether it's reality TV or racism or a presidential campaign or a casino. I mean, I could be off on it, but to me, like when I read about this, because again, it was Trump, but it was also the New York Post. The New York Post had a headline with a picture of these boys and it said animals. Ed Koch said things like this. There was something like the media was driving it as well in a very significant way. That's where the whole like wilding thing even comes from.
Yeah, and problems like that, I still talk about that. Problems like that Trump is not the only racist in the world. Right. And a lot of well-meaning people have, for lack of a better word, like racial blind spots. And yeah, and they're not willing to hire people of color in these newsrooms for many different reasons. I was just reading a piece I want to say New York Times Magazine, about the former editor-in-chief of Vanity Fair. And he was asked, in his 25-year tenure, about his hiring practices. So when it comes to hiring, having diverse hiring practices, he said that he hired based on talent. And the reporter comes back and is like, yeah, well, everybody says that. And it's true. Everybody says that. And there are no black people, no brown people in any of these jobs. Some of the greatest publications that are quick to just call out how many disparities in our criminal justice system, in our healthcare system, in our educational system do not have black and brown people in their newsrooms. Some of the biggest, most amazing places in politics who are all willing to, say that black women in the South are who's going to decide this primary, don't have black women on their staff. You know what I mean? And so if we're even... Now we're at the point where we're acknowledging black and brown people and their contributions to society, but they're still not getting the job. Way back then, it was even worse. And that's what happened. You have a newsroom full of people who are not all, but a lot of people actually scared of little black boys or don't have a problem with that. There's not enough people to speak up and say, hey, you know what? We shouldn't publish that. Hey, you know what? We should call it racism because it is. But you know what I mean? Like the problems that we're still having today, that is a symptom of the same. You know what I mean? I think that, so I'm not surprised by that. I'm not surprised that something like that took off because that's just America.
Right.
And that's what happens when you don't have people that move through this world with a different perspective. That's what happens when you don't have them next to you. You have your own beliefs, and you're willing to publish that as truth. Right. There are a lot of papers in the South that are all like just now coming out. National Geographic just did it. A lot of them now coming out and being willing to like publish these editorials apologizing for how they fueled racism decades ago and how it caused actual like physical harm to black people in the South, and how the National Geographic perpetuated these horrible stereotypes about black women. And so, I mean, we're trying to get there, but I'm not surprised. That's what happens when there's not enough people around you to say, well, wait a minute there.
Right.
Let's not call the kids animals,
Right. Let's not. Right. Just even like this very basic, like, I don't know. It's like capacity building that just like, when you are not in a monoculture.
Yeah.
That's right. I want to. This, in a way, in a very, I mean, there's a couple of like odd connections about what we're about to talk about next. It's way less important, but we have tabloid, we have people believing wild nonsense, and we have New York. So I want to play a brief clip just to set this up. I don't know if people remember 4 months ago, the head of the Gambino crime family was assassinated in Staten Island. Brooke, I feel a little bit guilty to admit this. Look, I don't want there to be violence. I don't want people to be hurt. But as somebody who reads a lot of books about Colombian drug cartels, the mafia, I was like, oh, wow. It's like, is a new war about to happen in New York City? I was thinking of a lot of like comedic scenarios of like a hit in front of like an acupuncture clinic, you know? But
I feel like I'm always, those kind of things, I'm like afraid to be reading them. Like,
wait, why are you afraid to be reading them? Why?
Like, afraid to read them, afraid to like tweet about El Chapo, afraid to be caught reading them. I don't want anything to do with it.
El Chapo. Some guy in Guadalajara is like, no, that chick on TYT is too smart.
Well, Michael was afraid to watch JFK by Oliver Stone.
That's a post-game story, my friends. Like Matt, Brooke, I'm going to be honest with you, and I'm going to pretend nobody else is watching or listening, even though a lot of people are. Matt is telling a private drug story from when I was like 15 years old to dunk on me, just so we're clear about what's going on. It's actually exactly what I would do, frankly. I'll just say I took mushrooms. I was 14 or 15. I had to go home, and my parents were asleep, and I was really into the movie JFK at the time, the Oliver Stone movie, which does not hold up well. I put that on, and 15 minutes into the movie, Brooke, I thought, because I was in that state, that the movie was part of the conspiracy. And what happened is, if you watch the movie, the CIA knew you needed to be taken out. So I crawled to turn it off. So someone didn't snipe me through the window. So I get it. Maybe we shouldn't even be talking about this. No, but let me play this. I want to set this segment up for us. We're going to play a brief news report about this, and then I'm going to throw it to you, Brooke, because don't worry. This is about, we're really talking about QAnon. We're in no way disrespecting the Gambino family. In fact, you'll feel bad for the boss of the Gambino family. He got killed for doing the most righteous thing he's ever done in his life. All right, let's watch this.
Camelo faces murder, assault, and weapon possession charges in the death of reputed Gambino family boss Francesco Frankie Boy Cali. High-power lawyer Robert Gottlieb is his defense attorney.
The issue of safety for Mr. Camelo while he's imprisoned is real.
At his
you
last
hear that, Brooke?
hearing,
It's real.
Camelo flashed his hand at reporters, scrawled with pro-Trump messages, writing on his hand with blue ink, MAGA forever, and a large Q.
That was real. That was what he wanted to express that date.
Additionally, the NYPD said their officers had come into contact with Camelo twice in February, once at a New York courthouse where he told officers he wanted to make a citizen's arrest of Congresswoman Maxine Waters and Congressman Adam Schiff, both Democrats, and a day later at Gracie Mansion where he told officers he was there to arrest Mayor Bill de Blasio. Gottlieb wouldn't clarify what his client's recent changes in behavior had to do with Cali's death.
Brooke, what do you, and again, all respect to the five families, but Brooke, what do you think of this?
First of all, my name is no longer Brooke while we're doing this story.
Excuse me.
No,
Anonymous guest one.
There was another part of that that is really scary. Just thinking about the fact that this man actually was so wrapped up in this love for Donald Trump and willing to just do anything, throw out all logic, that he walked up to who he knew was his mob boss, to his house, to his personal home, and knocked on the door and asked him to come outside. And at some point, somehow, he pulled a gun and shot the man. But thinking about how that went down and how at least from his attorneys, he wanted to make a citizen's arrest and turn this man into the military for Trump, right? He also wanted to do that to the Honorable Congresswoman Maxine Waters. And that scares me because I know there are a lot of threats against her constantly, and just how this went wrong, it worries me about like if he had gotten too close to her and how, this is all wild and crazy. And then you think about how much scarier it could have been, and that how there are people in 2019 walking around willing to do stuff like this, and their president generally calls them good people.
Well, I was not only good people, I can imagine Trump, because, I think we know that Trump dealt with people like this in the 80s and the 90s. Imagine Trump would be like, I had no idea. If you could just convince them of QAnon, I could have dealt with all of my labor disputes.
Something you said earlier, you were talking about.
He had no idea. His whole building process could have been easier if Alex Jones was alive.
Exactly. The man likes attention. He likes attention. There was something at the beginning of that about threats on his life. If you were his brother, would you move?
Definitely. 100%. 100%. I mean,
find me in London.
100%. Oh no, not somewhere that people don't go for fun. And what I had actually heard though, did you hear that? Yes, he had this whole list of people because he's obviously out of his mind, but that specifically he was upset at Callie because Callie told him to stay away from his niece, which is why I was saying this guy could have been killed for being like a nice uncle after all the other things he did in his life.
Yeah. After everything, right? Ugh.
Do you get, as like a final question, I'm just kind of curious. The QAnon stuff is like, I'll have right-wing people, like particularly kind of like, twerpy IDW people will bother me, like Ben Shapiro people, whatever. I don't really see QAnon stuff that much like in my timelines or my world, but clearly it's a really big thing. Do you like see it out there, or do you have to actually like read about it and learn about it?
I don't see it out there. And the reason we don't see it is because it doesn't make enough sense to formulate a complete sentence.
Right. You don't want JFK Jr. to still be alive?
I'll watch it. Wait. Oh my goodness. It's so weird, right?
It's very
so weird. These people are serious. I never want to be trapped in that side of Twitter. And never.
Neither do I. We'll never do another segment on the mafia or QAnon again.
What's the mafia?
Brooke Thomas, I really, really appreciate you doing this. This is awesome. We'll definitely have to have you on again soon if you can. Check out all of Brooke's work. She's a TV host, an anchor, and of course, she is a part of our friends, the Young Turks. Brooke, thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Awesome. Take care.
All right, bye.
Bye. All right, folks. I still can't get over that story, honestly. I know like one time Felix and I were supposed to talk about it, but he is in jail or in court after assassinating the head of the Gambinos, doing this Q nonsense. It's so bizarre. It's so like, it is like an times dilated, to be fair to Mike Cernovich, is just the stupid way of saying what Adam Curtis says in all of his documentaries, though, in a way.
Right.
Like, time is getting dilated.
It's weird because I think the internet exists, but I also think like when you look at the history of people who've like taken shots at political leaders, for instance, they have some weird causes themselves.
That's
actually
very true. That is very true. Well, to be actually pushed to that, you probably have to be pretty I'll buy a thread.
But I think the weirder thing about the QAnon thing is how popular it is. Honestly, like
and
if you
particularly
go,
boomers, right?
And if you go on like Trump's Twitter, oftentimes I was screenshotting it the other day. Maybe I'll find him later. It's just like account after account going on about this. So it's a pretty wide conspiracy theory, unlike the other ones, which are a little bit more contained.
Right. Well, I love the Mueller is secretly working with Trump one. All right, folks. Here's what we're gonna do. I'm really excited about this interview with Celso Amorim. So I will appreciate, and I don't necessarily look at the live chat that much, but I will say this is one where don't spend the Celso Amorim interview writing about who your favorite YouTuber is. Pay some goddamn attention, all right? Foreign Policy Magazine said this man was the best foreign minister in the world. But in all seriousness, I mean, we covered a lot of ground here. I'm really proud of this. Become a patron today. That's how all of this happens. Get your tickets to the Chicago live show. When we come back from the interview, David is going to do his gem segment, and then we're going to go to the post game, and we've got to talk about what's happening in the UK and a whole bunch of other things. This interview was recorded on Thursday, and it's about 40 minutes long, and I'd urge you to check out Celso's book, which is in English, called Acting Globally. It came out in 2018. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now, and it's very much an honor to have him on our 100th show, is Celso Amorim. He served as the foreign minister in the Lula da Silva administration's 2003 to 2010, and he also served as a defense minister for Dilma Rousseff from 2011 to 2014, where at one time he was actually named the best foreign minister in the world by Foreign Policy Magazine. Celso Amorim, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, Michael.
Can you start? We'll work backwards, but I'd like your thoughts on some things and we'll certainly be talking about your work on behalf of President Lula, who we have spent a significant amount of time talking about on this show. It's recently come to our attention that President Jair Bolsonaro wants to appoint his son as ambassador to the United States. I will say, as an American, this is a very Trump-style move. so I could see how that thought process might work. What's your perception of that? And more broadly, what Bolsonaro has done to Brazilian foreign policy?
Well, let us start with your first part of your question. I think for Brazilian, for someone who, I'm a career diplomat originally, so it's very shocking for me. Unlike the United States, it's not a current practice to appoint people who are not diplomats as ambassadors. That happens. It has happened in the past. It's not forbidden, especially the second term in Lula's government. There was no appointment of this kind, but it's not illegal as such. Of course, in this case, it's not only a non-diplomat, but it's his son, which makes it, let us say, a kind of a family affair. And it's especially, I mean, someone who has no experience actually in foreign policy. That's not my opinion. You know, this is the opinion of conservative people that have been commenting on that. And, you know, the institution, the Foreign Minister of Brazil, Itamaraty, as it's known, it is highly respected in Brazil, and it has been highly respected actually around the world. I could see that, and that's not, I'm not saying that's on my account. That has been like that for 50 years or so. And so to have someone with no experience, practically no experience, is already very shocking. The fact that he's a son is something that never happened in Brazil, as far as I know. It's to Washington. It's not any post, by the way. And also, but I'm probably more concerned with another aspect, because all the opinions of this Congressman Eduardo Bolsonaro are extreme right-wing. He's seen, and actually has been mentioned by Steve Bannon as the representative of his movement for Latin America. So actually, what worries me more than anything else is the creation of a kind of an axis of extreme right right-wing people between the United States and Brazil. So I don't know how are the relations between Steve Bannon and Trump now. I know that he has been actually dismissed from his post in the White House. Well, but that actually reminds me of Guevara and Fidel Castro. I mean, when Guevara was getting too important inside, Fidel Castro asked him to go around the world, and that's what seems to me that Steve Bannon is doing. And so I think this very much extreme right axis is dangerous for our hemisphere and for the world. So this is what concerns me more than anything else.
Well, that's a powerful comparison. I think it actually makes perfect sense, the Castro-Guevara comparison, except, of course, in every regard in terms of style, appearance, humanity. But yes. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? And then we'll go back into the kind of counter project that you were involved in as foreign minister. But when you look at and so much of the conversation in the United States and so much of what we're doing on this program, but also internationally, as people deal with the rise of far-right politics in a variety of contexts, United States, Brazil, India, the UK, so on, France to a strong degree, the debate is about conditions. What leads to this? What is it historically in terms of countries' economic systems? What is the racial histories? What are the modern failures of center-left governments? And more broadly, I mean, well, let me ask you that first. What do you think is giving the Bannons of the world an opportunity in this moment? What has led up to this?
Well, maybe in one word or a few words, is frustration with the results of globalization. I mean, I would say, which is not something surprising, because I think it would be expected. But at the same time, these people, this is very much like some countries in Europe in the 30s. The people are frustrated with economic conditions, with everything that's happening. At the same time, they don't want to lose their privileges, or what they see as their privilege vis-a-vis of lower classes. So they tend to extreme right options. This is precise, and tend to see enemies in people who are somehow below their own status. I mean, that happened in Germany in relation to Jews or to whatever, but it happens now in Europe in relation to immigrants. Immigrants is also a problem in the United States. Well, in Brazil, we don't have these problems, although people are trying to invent them, actually. Brazil didn't sign, actually it signed, but it went out of the new convention on immigration, on global immigration. And this was pure imitation of Trump, because we don't have an immigration problem. I mean, the number of immigrants in Brazil is ridiculous. It's much smaller than the number of Brazilians who live abroad now. So, but there is this compulsion to imitate Trump. But coming back to the conditions, I think there are always the people who are, in a way, threatening your own situation. Maybe immigrants, it may be, they say, Jews or foreigners or whatever. And I think in our case, this has to be seen internally as the people from lower classes threatening to have a better share in the GDP, in the income, and of course this was more or less tolerated when the economy was growing. But once the economy falters and let us say the cake becomes doesn't grow so fast, then the reaction of the people who feel threatened and who feel frustrated by this globalized world order or economic order, they tend to go against the poorer, and they tend to embrace radical far-right doctrines. I mean, of course, it's a very complex problem, and I'm oversimplifying it, but I mean, that's what I see in common between countries that are so different, like the UK and Brazil or Poland and the United States.
One of the things that's an exception in Brazil in some ways, at least it seems to me, and this is when we can, start talking about the Workers' Party record and the leadership of Lula and the foreign policy you charted with him. When it comes to the United States and the rise of Trump, it's very easy. Well, it's not easy, but one trajectory is the foundational, and it manifests in different ways depending on economic conditions and circumstance, but that this is a historically racialized and racist politics. And then you look at the modern Republican Party, Richard Nixon, and the Southern Strategy, and you can draw a straight line. As outlandish as he is, Donald Trump is in a clear tradition. And then you can also say that our Democratic Party has, in certain areas been at times more socially progressive and so on, but it has not. I mean, it has not been something that has protected people from the bad effects of globalization you mentioned. In fact, it's been an agent of globalization, of a very kind of corporate variety. So in some ways, the disillusionment, and now we see the resurgence of Bernie Sanders and so on, so it's much more complicated now. But the disillusionment in the United States seems very clear, the different causal conditions. What shocked us is that in Brazil this happened, and you have, a president who pulled tens of millions of people out of poverty, who really increased a broad-based well-being. If President Obama did for the United States what Lula did for Brazil, we would say he's the best president that we ever had. So what's the sort of complication in the Brazil? Is it as simple as the economy slowing down under Dilma?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, who would say what precisely? Because in Brazil, of course, many people think that Lula is the best president we ever had.
Right.
The problem is that you have, let us say, the economic elite who doesn't want to go on dividing each part of the national income. You have many people in the lower middle class who feel threatened. I mean, and they tend to think in comparative terms. So it is all right for them to be not to be so well, provided there are people who are lower than them. But if these people are now growing, precisely the reason why the right wing in Brazil grew is precisely because Lula took, one of the reasons is because he took 20, 30, maybe 40 million people out of poverty. I mean, that's threatening for those who consider themselves, it's a very stratified society. Brazil had slavery until very late in the 19th century. Actually, if you look at Brazil as it is today, although our forms of discrimination have been historically more subtle than those in the United States or certainly South Africa in the past, but it's a very unequal society. And this has several dimensions, including a race dimension as well. So I think when people see that, the place for their children in school in universities might be threatened by quotas, or when they think that some part of their income will be taken away to improve or some time of the extra income would be taken away to improve the lot of the poorer people. They tend to, and especially when the economy becomes, as it did, it slows down, and we had a very big recession. When that happens, all these things together tend to favor these extremist positions, and which have, of course, racist connotations. It has connotations in terms of gender. It has connotations, I saw now in Poland that they are trying to create kind of areas which would be quote unquote free from LGBT or gays.
Yeah.
Well, the same attitude, maybe not yet the same measures, but the same kind of attitude is now being seen in Brazil. And I mean, the fact, the way that many of the progresses that were made in relation to, let us say, the Brazilians of African origin or indigenous, they are being rolled back. which never happened before in Brazil. I mean, even if you talk to a conservative in the 90s or the 80s, or even the late period in the military dictatorship or military government, the conservatives would not agree with making more progress, but they would not try to roll back that. I mean, that had never happened, at least not in the scale that we're seeing now. And this has to do with labor laws. It has to do with the many human rights provisions, with indigenous people. As I said. And I think, again, what causes people to embrace these ideologies? I mean, I don't want to sound in any way that I'm discriminating against any religion, but I think some forms of fanatical religion have also something to do with that.
Yes, I mean, that seems very clear that whether you're talking United States or Brazil or Saudi Arabia or Poland, that especially when there's a vacuum created for a constructive politics, religion, fanatical religion, not all religion, obviously, but a fanatical religion came
distrust from science, distrust from knowledge, distrust from culture. All these, I mean, if you read books about Germany in the 30s, it sounds familiar.
Right. So can you talk about the foreign policy that you charted with President Lula in two ways? I mean, one, how does it seemed like from reading about it, and obviously you correct me if I'm wrong, but that it was a seamless connection, that the incredible efforts and achievements against poverty and inequality in Brazil were connected to how Brazil saw itself in the world in terms of its relationships from West Africa to the United States, from the Caribbean to Israel, Palestine. And this, I don't know if this is the right word, but that there was an idea maybe of a non-aligned foreign policy, not trying to have conflicts or bad relations with anyone, but positive, constructive relationships with all, built on Brazil's historical connections.
Well, I think you're right when you say there is this kind of. Let me just make a parenthesis here, because I have a book which was published in the United States by Rowland and Littleton, which is precisely about the assertiveness of Brazilian foreign policy during the Lula period. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that with Lula coming to power, in a way, it was an anticipation of the slogan or the motto of Obama's. I mean, yes, we can. I mean, yes, we can have someone who was a worker, a metal worker, of very, very poor origin, become president, being faithful to his origins and still be able to conduct foreign policy in a very assertive way. And as you said, I mean, Brazil did what it did at the time, involved in very complex questions from WTO to the Iranian nuclear program. I mean, and became involved also in Palestine and all that, and integration of South America. We doubled the number of our embassies in Africa. But all that had to do with that assertiveness that to some extent had to do with the coming to power to Lula, and to the fact that when Lula came to power, the biggest flaw of Brazilian society, which was inequality, which, as I said, comes back from slavery, but went on and on and on. The biggest flaw was for the first time attacked seriously. I mean, the Bolsa Familia, the stipendium that's given to families, the quotas, the programs for housing. I mean, all these things, the family agriculture, mind you, it's many programs. So that gave us a kind of self-confidence that we didn't have before. And of course, Brazil is a big country. We have borders with 10 countries. We have diversified relations in any case, contrary to other countries because of geography or whatever, or history. So all that gave confidence and allowed us to lead this kind of foreign policy, which was actually well received. And I tell you, it's not that Brazil tried to be there present. Brazil was called. I mean, I remember, for instance, an Egyptian foreign minister calling me and say, please, Celso, ask Lula to call Shimon Peres, because the situation here in Gaza, or it was East Jerusalem, I'm not sure now what it was, the situation, is untenable, and Lula can influence. Don't underestimate the influence of Brazil. So Brazil had apparently this characteristic of soft power that in spite of the problems that we still had, but we were tackling them. So we had tackled in the past the problem of democracy, the problem of the absence of democracy. We were tackled in the past in different governments, the problem of the economic instability. And now with Lula, we were tackling the biggest problem, in my opinion, which is social inequality. So all that, apart from the size of the country, the demographics, the economic, Brazil is one of the 10 biggest economies. At some point was the 6th or 7th. Never very sure, because this depends on exchange rates and so on. But anyway, so all these things put together, plus a strong diplomacy, which is being destroyed now by this, well, destroyed or at least maimed now by this kind of action that you mentioned at the beginning, all that gave Brazil a voice in world affairs. And, I'm not speaking things abstractly. I mean, I'm saying, for instance, we had the group in relation to the reform of the Security Council, which united Germany, Japan, India, and Brazil. So the so-called aspiring countries to become permanent members in whatever format. I mean, don't want to go into that. But I remember the German foreign minister asking me to say, please, Celso, talk to the Africans, because they listen to you. They don't listen to me so much. He was saying that. So, that's the mixture of these national characteristics which are now being undermined. I mean, they were not so solid as we thought, unfortunately. I have to admit that. Because even during the military regime in Brazil, the military dictatorship, it was seen as something somehow strange to the country. It was not. It might have some popularity at some point when there was strong economic growth, but the kind of hatred that you see now, the kind of massive attack on culture, on education, on foreign policy, because foreign policy, of course, necessarily has an ideological dimension. Ideological not in the sense only of being right or left, but in the sense of solidarity, right, or self-assertiveness or whatever. All these things are being attacked in a way that were never before, not in the same scale. So on the same scale. So that's again make us think that maybe many of the characteristics of the Brazilian people, which we thought were positive, like the tolerance and solidarity and so on, were not so solid as we thought.
Do you see?
These are states of mind. Yeah. So maybe with proper leadership and proper conditions, they may rise again.
Do you see specifically, because I would like, maybe you could speak to both things, because I would like you to speak to Lula as a political prisoner, but maybe even more broadly, we spoke with Valeska Martins on the show several months ago. Yeah. We do a lot of coverage of foreign policy and the U.S. role in the world. It's a large role. How do we navigate solidarity as we as we sit in Brooklyn and think through these things? Do you think there was a U.S. role in the lawfare and political process against Lula and the Workers' Party? And if so, where would that was that just because of the basic claims of sovereignty over Brazil of the Lula government?
Well, I think, I don't want to make like one of the prosecutors here that he said, I don't have the evidence, but I have the conviction. So I don't want to say the same thing about Lula. But
Thank you.
That's a judicial process. It's different from politics. On politics, you can make inferences. And what I would say is that by the logic of things, I have the impression that, yes, there was, and by also the evidence, the scant evidence that we might have, but it's some evidence anyway of cooperation between the car wash operation and the attorneys in the United States and the DOJ in the United States. I think it very probably, yes, there was a role for the United States. How much it was a planned role, how much it was instigating in the beginning by the United States, or it was the other way around. It started when I say the United States, it's not necessarily the United States government. It was not necessarily Obama. Actually, mind you, when Snowden made those revelations about spying in Brazil, Germany, and other countries, well, Obama gave the impression that he didn't know. I'm not sure that he knew or he didn't. But anyway, so there are things, which come from the intelligence community, which come from other places, or which come from the interest of financial capital, in which the government is not necessarily involved. But if you read some declarations, for instance, from the former ambassador in Brazil, was former undersecretary or even deputy secretary, undersecretary, I think, in the United States, Tom Shannon, you'll see that he says more or less that and I think this was in an interview, I don't remember, I don't know if it was Forbes or anything like that, in the United States. Tom Shannon saying that we followed with great attention, concern, I don't know what was the precise word, what Brazil was trying to do in terms of integration of South America, forming a bloc with more participation in world affairs. And now it's not him saying, but I'm saying, and at the same time you had things like the BRICS, which somehow had an impact on the world balance or whatever. So I would not be surprised. And you had the oil and the findings of the oil in the deep sea in Brazil, and the decision to take the oil for us. So, if you take all these things together, I would not be surprised that something, I don't know if there is a deep state as such in terms of an entity, but that these interests together could well have, I'm certain, more or less certain, that these have helped the lawfare that took place in Brazil. And not only the lawfare, also the political implications in Congress and otherwise, with the impeachment of Dilma and all that. I'm pretty convinced of that. But, I don't have evidence for everything, but I think it's the natural thing. And, everything that we have seen from communications that were in the WikiLeaks to other things that even were said publicly. In the case of the legal cooperation, there was an attorney of the United States who said very clearly that he praised the kind of informal cooperation. What is informal cooperation? It's the cooperation without the knowledge of the governments. So, and that's what, and if you take the national security document in the United States, it puts fight against corruption as a number one thing. It used to be fight against terrorism, and now it's corruption. Okay, it's okay to fight terrorism, it's okay to fight corruption, but it can also be used to regime change, as it has been used in many places.
Well, that's actually, and I hope, I should just say, I really hope that we can host you again, if that's possible, because there's so many other things I'd like to ask you about, but I know we don't have so much time left. But before we get to my more sort of closing question, that's a big concern to me, this discourse of corruption, both in terms of U.S. foreign policy, and yes, okay, it maybe has exposed, that former Malaysian prime minister, as an example, really was, implicated in this sort of massive hedge fund sort of theft and so on. It's not to deny that corruption.
Speaking of Lula, Lula even if the accusations are right, were right, which they are not. But if they were right, it's the reform of a toilet in a very poor farm in the interior of Sao Paulo, and things like that.
So the charges against Lula are shocking. Anytime an American, particularly Americans who are lawyers, I will say, who have no interest and no investment in this, if they hear the basics of the case and they say, hey man, if you're telling me everything, that's crazy. How did that even make it to trial? But the corruption rhetoric is a tool of U.S. foreign policy. And then there's also the fact that all of these right-wing governments that we've been talking about earlier, Donald Trump talked about drain the swamp. Bolsonaro said he'd get rid of corruption. In Poland, they have brought forward anti-corruption legislation. In India, Modi was quite connected to anti-corruption drives. So You have in the case of someone like Lula that absolutely the charges from everything I can see are totally false and wrong. But there's also a broader problem with usually politicians, by the way, that are very corrupt themselves, using a language of corruption that makes it about morality, not about the system itself. Of course, Washington is corrupt. It's run by special interest money. Of course, there's corruption in political systems, but it becomes about personal morality of usually left-wing leaders or center-left leaders that can be demonized. And then these right-wing politicians are able to use this very simplified rhetoric.
Yes, let me say one thing. Of course, it's part of the U.S. foreign policy, but it's very much part also of the thinking of the elite in Brazil. Of course, the bankers who get millions and millions and millions of reais or U.S. dollars or whatever, they are financing the newspapers and the media in general, like the TV, like TV Globo, for instance, and they are using this rhetoric also. I mean, it's not something totally important. It's also important, but it's also part of the ideology of the ruling classes. When they can't find any other reason or any other argument that will be convincing for the people, corruption is a very strong thing. In Brazil, it's not the first time. Of course, for the times differ, so it's difficult to compare exactly. But when we had Vargas in the 50s, were elected democratically, but he ran policies for the workers and also took decisions on sovereignty, as you say, in the question of the oil company Petrobras, creating a national bank for development and so on. The same thing happened. He was accused of corruption very strongly. There was almost a coup d'etat. He committed suicide. He died, and nothing was discovered later. It was abandoned because the objective was there, or was obtained, which was to. So it's a very powerful weapon and very, on the other hand, very abstract. So it's easy. It's something that you can tell almost of anybody. Because what is corruption? Was it one specific bribe about one person? Is it tolerating a bribe somewhere else? Was not even. What is it? I don't know. When you listen to some of the attorneys in Brazil, prosecutors, whatever, the attorneys, they seem to say that Lula was the head of a big, was the couple of the whole thing. And so he must have known. On the other hand, the accusations against him are not the formal accusations by which he was condemned. Don't deal with that because they know that they couldn't prove that. So they use one thing politically and look for a very, very absurd thing. And would it be right to be minor to accuse him?
Right.
With the absurd conclusion that Lula is the head of a criminal organization in which all other members got much more than he. What kind of this is hard even to conceive of, So it's very clear that the objective was to topple Dilma, to prevent Lula from running, because they don't want a progressive government in Brazil. And the progressive in Brazil has two dimensions, I would say. One is, let us say, towards internally to diminish inequality, and there is an external one, which is to have an independent foreign policy based on solidarity with other developing countries, and having good relations with the United States. I mean, Lula and Bush went very well, actually. I went very well with Colin Powell, Condi Rice. Of course, we had different points of view on some questions, but very cordially, very friendly. So one thing didn't prevent the other. But even so, the independence after the crisis of you have also to see the crisis of 2008. So the financial capital is needing more markets to be more sure about the markets. So there is a combination of things. There are geostrategic things, which also have a big weight, of course. I mean, everybody is preoccupied with democracy in Venezuela, which, okay, I'm also preoccupied with democracy in Venezuela, but no one worries with democracy in Saudi Arabia.
Right.
No?
I think the worry about Saudi Arabia from the Trump administration is quite different, to say the least. Maybe there's an opportunity for some very special forms of foreign direct investment from Saudi.
I don't have the evidence.
No, we have no evidence. We have no evidence of this. We know, but certainly there's not a concern for democracy. So, as a final question, I would like to ask you two things. One that's more just sort of personal. Do you see and visit President Lula? What is your sense of, especially in light of we interviewed Glenn Greenwald, of course, with all of these revelations, and we've regularly followed the work of Brian Mayer and Brazil Wire, which is how we come to you. Mm-hmm. And then more broadly, if you're speaking to an audience that is everywhere, but mostly in the United States, what is the significance of freeing Lula as a political prisoner, obviously first and foremost for Brazil, but also in a way that is connected to the broader struggle against the kind of global far right that we were talking about in the beginning?
Well, I think the liberation of Lula would have a global impact. Lula is, of course, as you said, is a reformist, a progressive, but he's a man of dialogue. He's a man, no one was put in prison. No capitalist can complain of not being received by Lula, or at least his representatives, or his or her representatives. So I think, and what Brazil needs more than anything else now is dialogue, peaceful dialogue between different, and the recovery of the, let us say, the rational discourse, because now it's irrationality. It's typical of the far right. The irrationality to play the far right is not new in the history of mankind. Humankind, we had that in the 30s, as I mentioned before. Actually, by the way, you mentioned corruption being used. And the other day I was reading an article in the FT, and the illustration, I don't know if it was in the paper, but that's what I saw on the internet. The illustration was a poster from 35 or 36 in Germany. It's a big army, and it's an official poster, from what I could guess. It was with an arm of a person, which is creating fight corruption, and written fight corruption, and the hand was smashing Jews and communists. So that's how it is used.
Right. And do you see President Lula? Oh, sorry.
Not only for Brazil, but I think it is important for all developing countries, and to a large extent, even to the balance of the world, because not Brazil will be decisive. I don't have any. But if you have Brazil going in a more democratic way, if India was going also in a more democratic way, and if we have a dialogue with different countries of different ideologies and so on, this helps the world to find. And this was, it's not only me. I was Foreign Minister for Lula, so it's natural that I try to defend his legacy. But I heard that, and actually I promoted a seminar based on what I heard from Dominique de Villepin, who was foreign minister for a center-right government in France by Chirac. And he said, we need Brazil for the world balance more than ever. I mean, he was speaking about Trump and this right-wing movement. But it must be a democratic Brazil. And that's really what we don't have now. We are running fast to a very I'm very much concerned. I don't want to use words because, it's very easy to speak about fascism or whatever. And each ideology has its time, but we are going to very extreme situations, the denial of rationality, the denial of science, which affects environment, affects human rights, affects whatever you want. And all that is very worrying. And it's not new in the world. It's new in Brazil.
And do you see President Lula from time to time, and how is he?
Well, he hasn't. I've seen him 5 times after he has been in prison. He can receive 2 visitors a week. Apart from family, who also once a week, and apart from the lawyers. So I went there 5 times, always with someone else. Sometimes Brazilian. In 2 cases was some foreign visiting us. The last one, the latest one was the candidate of the Cristina Kirchner and the Justicialist party in Argentina, Alberto Fernandez, who actually also was the person who introduced me to the Pope. The Pope also has been speaking indirectly, but he has been speaking about lawfare, actually about lawfare directly, but indirectly about the Lula situation. Lula has a very high spirit. It's very puzzling even for you to see someone who has been because it's jail after all. I mean, it's not luxury at all, but it's maybe correct for someone to say it's not. But it doesn't have a sight outside. It has it's the window. There's a window for light comes in, but he cannot see outside. So it's a jail in a way. And his spirits, he's always thinking and analyzing the situation in Brazil, proposing solutions. He reads a lot. So he's prepared. I mean, it's very sometimes you have to be prepared to be in prison. He's prepared to be put out of prison.
Right. Well, Celso Amorim, we really, really appreciate your time. I missed that?
No, I mean, in the case of Lula, indignation, yes, but no depression or whatever.
That's amazing.
That's amazing. Yeah.
We really appreciate your time. Celso Amorim served as a foreign minister in the Lula da Silva government, defense minister for Dilma Rousseff. He was also an ambassador to many countries besides that, lifelong diplomat, strategist. I hope you can join us again sometime, and we really appreciate it.
I'm also an author of a book published in the U.S.
Tell me the name of the book again, please, because we'll...
Well, the book is called, it's precisely about one of your questions, so that's why I mentioned it. It's
Please.
Act Globally, Memoirs of Brazil's Assertive Foreign Policy, and it is published by Rowman and Middleton.
We'll have all of the information to the book as well and all of the show descriptions, and people will find it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, and I just ordered that book, of course. Celso Amorim, it was a real honor to have him on. And great debut of Brooke Thomas. Matt coming in heavy to get a magic mushroom story out of me on the main show. Which I guess is for some people who go like, I love the show, but I want more comedy in the main part.
I was just trying to make the guest feel more comfortable by helping you two relate.
I think Bernie or Bust Bill definitely needs to become an Andrew Yang fan. Do you want to explain for a second, Matt, what the whole cursing thing is?
Oh, yeah.
It's actually crazy.
So YouTube has a fun little, I call it the Crowder rule, where you have to self-report your video for things like adult content, drug glorification, swearing. Things
well
like
done,
that.
Matt.
Yeah, no, I'm fucked on YouTube. Damn it.
You just keep creating more work for yourself, Mr. Waterboat.
So now when you upload a video, you have to do that for every single one of them. So we're going to try to mind our language a little bit better than I'm able to.
Hey, Matt, well done. You really kept focus there.
Flushing money down the drain.
In terms of the profanity and drug-free content, you brought a certain level of focus and precision.
Tulsi allowed you to F and swear.
Mate, if you'd support Tulsi in suing Google, then maybe you'd be able to use the proper language. But you won't because you're a fucking sellout, and I'm sorry I had to do that. The clip is already in ruins. All right. We have to do the gem segment before we get to the post game. David Griscom, what do we got?
Yeah, I mean, so over the weekend, there were massive power outages in Washington, D.C., which were very significant, around 39,000 people without power in weather that was in the upper 90s.
Yep.
They're not alone. New York City also had a major power outage. And
Con Edison helpfully choosing to put the power off in Canarsie, a predominantly black and working class neighborhood, as a conscious decision.
Mm-hmm.
Wonder why they chose that place.
Well, absolutely.
Well done
and we're
by
going to...
the should be immediately seized Con Ed. Sorry to step on you.
Oh, no. I mean, that's exactly what we're talking about. I mean, our friend Bill de Blasio, who's been cosplaying a radical leftist for the past couple of months, did come out.
I like de Blasio's campaign mode.
It has been fun to watch. But,
yes.
Came out and said that he was, basically threatened Con Ed with a public takeover of the company if they can't get themselves together. And in D.C., we're also looking at another one of these private electricity corporations. Now, we've already talked a lot about the nightmare that is PG&E, but I really wanted to take a moment to talk about the devastation and the problems that have come from the private ownership of our public utility system in the United States. So over 70% of household energy consumption comes from private sources in the United States. That has not always been the case. In the 80s and 90s, there was a huge rush for privatization. And the problem that comes with privatization is that you have, one, massive inequities, as Michael was just talking about in the practice, and two, the profit motive is always creating hiccups in these services. So, in the case of PG&E, obviously to hold on to their monopoly, they have to lobby and spend $10 million a year to be able to afford lobbyists, where a company that was owned by the city would not necessarily have that tension. And when we're talking about moving towards a Green New Deal and dealing with the ecological effects of climate change, our energy consumption is going to be the number one way that we start to deal with that problem. So currently, only 17% of the United States electricity comes from renewables. We obviously need to be moving towards 95 to 100% in the near future. That's going to be very difficult to do if you're dealing with private boards. Not only is publicly owned utilities, city-owned utilities, better for democratic control, they also tend to be dramatically cheaper. Publicly in 32 out of 48 states where both public and private electric systems are in existence, 32 are cheaper than the overall 48. So it actually tends to be significantly cheaper. Just looking at one example, Winter Park, Florida, which was able to wrestle after a long fight with their privately owned utility system, was able to wrestle it into public control. Now the city is getting back $48 million in general revenue, which not only goes to the electrical grid, but it also helps support city services and the municipality function. And residents of Winter Park, Florida are paying 12% less than their neighbors. Texas is another great example of this. In 1999, our good friend George Bush deregulated the Texas electrical system, and that was supposed to create competition, and competition would start kicking in.
Competition would start kicking in.
Exactly. I'm sure
Just
we
trying
have
to talk about ideas.
You got drones.
Yeah, you got drones. You got blah blah blah. There's not a single thing, Joe Rogan, that would hurt your
George
life.
Bush, Joe Rogan.
Well, that's too close. I was actually doing George Bush, Dave Rubin, but Joe Rogan may be a little too close, which is sort of like. So you're talking Marianne Williamson. That's not really politics, is it?
It's
like
honest,
people working together.
If George Bush was president right now, he would go on Joe Rogan's show.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, it's 100%.
But in Texas, 85% of residents get their electricity from the deregulated market.
Sorry.
What?
And he'd be really good at it.
He would,
which is
yeah.
scary.
Yeah, probably. 85% of residents get their electricity through the deregulated market, while the 15% that are still on the unregulated on the regulated markets, including cities like Austin, Texas, which owns their own electricity, and San Antonio, which also owns their electricity, pay significantly less than people who have privately held electric companies. And this is a significant tension as we start to want to transform our electrical system. Not only is it going to be much more difficult to create a green system under a privately held company, which is always trying to squeeze out as many profits as possible, the amount of failure in infrastructure in privately held companies is horrifying. The human cost in PG&E is very significant, and that comes from the fact that PG&E in California is always trying to pay out their stockholders and corporate salaries compared to publicly owned companies, which are able to take their revenue and invest in green energy. And it's not a surprise that many of the parts of the country that are leading in green energy are areas where their public system, their electricity system, is publicly controlled. And lastly, just to hit home what Michael was saying at the beginning, not only when we talk about public electricity and power for cities, we're talking about the effects of climate change, but we also need to talk about how those are produced and the direct effects of energy production in the United States. That means coal plants. And typically what happens with coal plants across the country is they are situated in poor, black, minority communities. If we are able to take this system under public control, we can put democratic pressure on these organizations. Now, that's not saying that just putting it under city control by itself will do it, but it's going to be far more responsive than the current system, where people who are just searching for endless profit are willing to pollute the earth, choke out the individuals in their community, and constantly fail to deliver reliable service at a fair price.
Excellent. Sam Harris was just talking about ideas, and he was smeared as anti-Muslim by the SJW left.
Actually, to be honest, Sam Harris is to George Bush's right.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't want to smear George W. Bush. He came out right after September 11th and said, basically, it's like, leave Muslims alone, and Islam is a religion of peace.
Look, Sam, we're gonna police them. Just cool it with some of the rhetoric, okay, buddy?
Look, I know what more Sam wants for bombing like 6 different countries simultaneously and killing people who have nothing to do with it. But because I'm not going up on national television and saying that Islam is the motherlode of bad ideas, this Golden Girls Trust Fund baby's having a conniption. Why don't you take a chill pill, Sam?
Scientific data can't be racist.
Actually, if you look at the mismeasure of man, I read a third of an assignment of before passing out drunk. Actually, sort of.
All of a sudden, we can't talk about Neanderthal DNA anymore.
You mean like the guys in the Budweiser commercials or the Geico ads? Jesus Christ, why do people like this guy? What a pain in the ass. You know, that was what made George W. Bush so likable, was that there was a part of his personality where you really did feel like he'd probably bully Sam Harris and it would be cool.
Yeah.
That was why he was cool. That was why people liked George W. Bush.
He was drunkenly dancing at the funeral for that Dallas cop. That was
like getting red. They're just like, come on, Michelle. Come on, you want candy?
Am I gonna be the only one dancing at this?
Get it? It's like, so we just announced a new drone program in Pakistan. That'd be funny. It's somehow if like Sam is calling him to whine. Because you could see, like, with Obama, it would just be, I think what Sam misses is that we need to build bridges in order to deal with the problem. Yeah. And then it would just be like, somehow George Bush would be like, so we just set off a brand new drone program in Pakistan, but I'm guessing you have a problem. I didn't say something about a thought experiment on national television in order to encourage yahoos to harass people who own 7-Elevens. Go ahead, Sam, bother me with your nonsense. It's actually a great character. Just George W. Bush George W. Bush dealing with Sam Harris.
Sam, I can just go to John Bolton if I want to hear about somebody talk about nuking Muslim communities.
Yeah, and at least she's a little bit animated. And doesn't think that having a 14-year-old's view of religion makes him a great intellect. Shut up, Sam.
You go and have your argument with Cenk Uygur.
I was really stimulating. I really love the way you used the nuclear football's thought experiment to say what you already said in the beginning, but pretend it was a hypothetical so you didn't have the balls to back up your actual position. Well done, Sam. All right, folks, we're going to go to the post game. Become a member of TMBS, patreon.com/TMBS. This is the way this whole thing happens. This is episode 100. I appreciate all of you. I just want to say really briefly, next week I'll be on The Hill for the second time at Crystal Ball, so you can check out my first appearance over there. I did a great interview with a channel called Rebel Base on YouTube with a guy named Greg Belvedere. We talked about ecology, socialism, psychedelics. It was really interesting, a little bit of a change of pace. And I was also on No Filter with Anna Kasparian, the great Anna Kasparian, one of our really good friends and regulars. She'll obviously be on TMBS again soon, but I want to let people know. Of course, if you haven't yet, check out Woke Bros, me and Waz, once a week on the Bomb feed on Black Opinions Matter. Just letting everybody know all the different things. Of course, Literary Hangover with Matt. Get it and become a patron today. If for some reason you haven't yet, subscribe. We crossed our first 60,000 subscribers. Let's get past 3,000 patrons in the fall. Let's get to 100,000 subscribers on YouTube in the fall so we can keep spreading this far and wide. Thank you for all the super chat donations. Thank you for taking us through 100 episodes. I appreciate all of you. I met Sam Nunberg on my return to I-24. We're playing it and talking about it, among many other things, in the postgame. See you there.